Know that feeling when you're the only one in the room who sees what others miss, when your mind processes patterns and connections that seem invisible to everyone around you, when you find yourself nodding along to conversations while internally screaming because people are missing the obvious underlying structures that govern their own thinking. It's a peculiar kind of loneliness, isn't it? This burden of understanding too much, of seeing too clearly into the mechanics of human cognition, while others remain blissfully unaware of the very processes that shape their reality. You've probably experienced this isolation in meetings where you recognize the developmental stage someone is operating from, watching them struggle with abstract concepts they're not quite ready to grasp, or feeling frustrated when people make decisions based on concrete thinking, when the situation clearly calls for formal operational reasoning. The weight of this awareness settles in your chest like a stone, creating distance, even in crowded rooms, because how do you explain to someone that their thinking itself has limits they don't even know exist? That their cognitive development has plateaus they might never transcend, that the very way they process information is fundamentally different from yours in ways that make true connection feel nearly impossible. This intellectual isolation becomes even more pronounced when you realize that most people around you are operating from what Jean Piaget identified as fundamentally different cognitive structures, literally seeing and processing the world through mental frameworks that bear little resemblance to your own advanced reasoning capabilities. The loneliness deepens when you understand that this isn't about intelligence in the traditional sense, but about developmental stages that create unbridgeable gaps in how reality itself is perceived and processed. You find yourself constantly translating your thoughts into simpler terms, dumbing down insights that feel natural to you, watching brilliant ideas lose their essence as you strip away the complexity that made them beautiful in the first place. Relationships suffer because you can predict conversational patterns, recognize cognitive limitations before they manifest, and see through the surface-level interactions that others find satisfying. The burden grows heavier when you realize that your ability to understand cognitive development so deeply actually prevents you from fully connecting with those still moving through earlier stages, creating a paradox where greater understanding leads to greater isolation, where the very knowledge that could help others connect remains locked behind cognitive barriers they're not yet equipped to see. Ross. What Jean Piaget discovered in his revolutionary research wasn't just how children develop cognitively, but why adults who achieve the highest levels of cognitive sophistication often find themselves walking through life fundamentally alone, carrying insights that others simply cannot access regardless of their motivation or effort. His work revealed that the man who understands too much walks alone, not because he chooses isolation, but because cognitive development creates natural barriers between different stages of thinking that no amount of good intention can bridge. Today, I'm going to show you exactly how Piaget's research explains this profound loneliness of advanced understanding, why it's actually a sign of reaching the highest cognitive stages rather than a personal failing, and most importantly, how to navigate relationships across these developmental gaps without losing your sanity or compromising your intellectual integrity. The story begins in 1920s Geneva, where a young Jean Piaget found himself in exactly this position of isolated understanding. Fresh from his work with Alfred Binet developing intelligence tests, Piaget had stumbled upon something that would change everything we know about human cognition, but nobody around him could see what he was seeing. While other researchers focused on whether children answered questions correctly, Piaget became fascinated by the patterns in their wrong answers, recognizing that these weren't random errors, but systematic differences in thinking itself. His colleagues thought he was wasting time analyzing mistakes instead of measuring intelligence, but Piaget had glimpsed something profound. Children weren't just little adults with less knowledge. They were operating from completely different cognitive structures that made certain kinds of thinking literally impossible until specific developmental thresholds were crossed. Picture Piaget in his laboratory, surrounded by skeptical colleagues who couldn't understand his revolutionary insight. He would spend hours interviewing children, asking them seemingly simple questions about conservation, classification, and logical relationships, documenting response patterns that revealed the existence of distinct cognitive stages. When he tried to explain his findings to fellow researchers, they dismissed his work as unscientific because it didn't fit the behaviorist paradigm dominating psychology at the time. They wanted measurable outcomes and standardized tests, while Piaget was mapping the internal architecture of human consciousness itself. The isolation he felt in those early years mirrors exactly what happens to anyone who achieves advanced cognitive development. You see patterns others miss, understand connections they can't make, and find yourself constantly frustrated by the limitations of those around you, who simply haven't reached the developmental stage necessary to grasp what you're sharing. This cognitive loneliness becomes particularly acute when you understand what Piaget called formal operational thinking, the highest stage of cognitive development that only about 30% of adults ever fully achieve. Those operating at this level can think abstractly about thinking itself, manipulate hypothetical scenarios mentally, and understand complex systems through multiple variables simultaneously. They can engage in metacognition, analyzing their own thought processes while simultaneously processing information at multiple levels of abstraction. When someone at this developmental stage tries to communicate with someone still operating primarily in concrete operational thinking, the gap becomes immediately apparent and deeply frustrating. The concrete thinker needs specific examples and step-by-step explanations for concepts that seem obviously connected to the formal operational thinker, creating conversations that feel like talking through thick glass, where both parties can see each other but nothing quite translates properly. Piaget documented this phenomenon extensively through his work with children transitioning between developmental stages. But he also observed it among adults in academic and professional settings. He noticed that individuals who had achieved formal operational thinking often reported feeling intellectually isolated, misunderstood by colleagues, and frustrated by the apparent inability of others to grasp concepts that seemed self-evident. This wasn't arrogance or intellectual snobbery, but a natural consequence of cognitive development, creating genuine barriers to communication and connection. When your mind can simultaneously hold multiple contradictory hypotheses, while evaluating them through complex logical frameworks, interacting with someone who needs concrete examples for every abstract concept becomes exhausting in ways that are difficult to explain without sounding condescending. The research reveals something fascinating about why highly developed thinkers often prefer solitude or seek out very specific types of intellectual companionship. In one of Piaget's most revealing studies, he observed groups of adults attempting to solve complex problems together. What he found was that individuals operating at higher cognitive stages consistently became frustrated not with the difficulty of the problems, but with the collaborative process itself. They would mentally solve the problem quickly through abstract reasoning, then spend enormous energy trying to walk others through step-by-step logical processes that seemed unnecessary and tedious. The advanced thinkers reported feeling like they were being forced to think more slowly and less efficiently when working with others, leading many to prefer working alone where they could operate at their natural cognitive pace without constant translation and explanation. This pattern extends far beyond academic or professional settings into every aspect of personal relationships. Consider Sarah, one of Piaget's adult subjects who had clearly achieved advanced formal operational thinking. She reported constant relationship difficulties because she could see patterns in people's behavior that they couldn't see themselves, predict outcomes they insisted wouldn't happen, and understand emotional dynamics at levels that made surface-level conversations feel meaningless. When friends came to her with problems, she could immediately identify the underlying systemic issues and potential solutions. But her attempts to share these insights often left people feeling judged, misunderstood, or overwhelmed. She wasn't trying to be superior. She simply couldn't turn off her natural tendency to analyze situations through multiple complex frameworks simultaneously. Over time, she found herself increasingly isolated, not by choice, but by the practical reality that most social interactions left her feeling drained from constantly moderating her natural thinking processes. The tragedy of advanced cognitive development, as Piaget discovered, is that it often leads to a kind of intellectual exile, where the very capabilities that make complex problem-solving effortless create barriers to human connection. People operating at formal operational levels find themselves constantly code-switching, translating their natural thought processes into simpler terms and suppressing insights that others aren't ready to receive. This constant intellectual self-censorship becomes exhausting, leading many to withdraw from social situations altogether, rather than continue the draining process of dumbing down their natural cognitive processes. They begin to prefer books over conversations, solitary activities over group interactions, and deep specialized interests over broad social engagement, because these provide spaces where they can think freely without constantly accommodating others' cognitive limitations. Look, I know this might sound familiar to anyone who's ever felt like their mind works differently from most people around them. Have you ever found yourself in conversations where you can see 3 steps ahead of where the discussion is going, but you have to pretend you're still figuring things out to avoid making others uncomfortable? Do you sometimes feel like you're watching a movie where everyone else is surprised by plot twists you saw coming from the opening scene? If this resonates with you, leave a comment saying, "I see the patterns others miss." Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to read today to feel less alone in their cognitive isolation. You have more power to help others understand this particular kind of loneliness than you realize. Piaget's research into what he termed cognitive egocentrism reveals another layer to this isolation that most people don't recognize. Unlike childhood egocentrism, where children can't distinguish their perspective from others, cognitive egocentrism in advanced thinkers involves the unconscious assumption that others have access to the same cognitive tools and frameworks that they do. A person operating at formal operational levels might explain something using abstract relationships and logical structures, genuinely believing they're being clear and helpful, only to watch others become confused or frustrated. The advanced thinker doesn't realize that their explanation requires cognitive capabilities the other person simply doesn't possess yet, creating a communication breakdown that leaves both parties feeling misunderstood and disconnected. This dynamic becomes particularly painful in intimate relationships where emotional connection requires cognitive compatibility at some level. Piaget observed couples where one partner had achieved formal operational thinking while the other remained primarily concrete operational, and the patterns were consistently challenging. The advanced thinker would analyze relationship dynamics through complex systemic frameworks, understanding patterns of interaction, predicting likely outcomes, and seeing solutions that required addressing multiple variables simultaneously. Meanwhile, their partner would focus on immediate concrete experiences, specific incidents, and simple cause and effect relationships. Neither approach was wrong, but the cognitive gap made it nearly impossible for them to meet each other at the level where real understanding happens. The formal operational thinker in these relationships often reported feeling like they were doing all the emotional and cognitive labor, constantly translating abstract insights into concrete examples, explaining connections that seemed obvious, and moderating their natural analytical tendencies to avoid overwhelming their partner. They would describe feeling intellectually starved, craving conversations that could match their cognitive complexity, but feeling guilty for wanting more than their partner could naturally provide. The concrete operational partner, meanwhile, often felt judged, inadequate, or confused by their partner's seemingly complex approach to simple situations, leading to cycles of frustration and disconnection that had nothing to do with love or commitment, and everything to do with fundamental differences in cognitive architecture. Piaget's longitudinal studies revealed that this cognitive loneliness often intensifies with age, as advanced thinkers become more aware of their isolation and less willing to constantly accommodate others' cognitive limitations. Young people operating at formal operational levels often maintain hope that others will eventually catch up, or that they can find ways to bridge the gaps through patience and better communication. However, as they accumulate decades of experience trying to connect across these cognitive barriers, many eventually accept that certain types of intellectual and emotional intimacy are simply not possible with people operating at different developmental stages. This acceptance can lead to a kind of resigned peace, but it also deepens the existential loneliness that comes with recognizing that your natural way of processing reality creates unavoidable distance from most other human beings. The social implications extend beyond personal relationships into professional and community contexts, where advanced cognitive development can actually become a liability. Piaget documented numerous cases of highly developed thinkers who struggled in work environments because their natural tendency to see complex patterns and systemic relationships made them seem impatient, critical, or difficult to work with. They would identify problems others couldn't see yet, propose solutions that addressed multiple variables simultaneously, and become frustrated when colleagues needed extensive explanation for connections that seemed self-evident. Over time, many learned to hide their cognitive capabilities, dumbing down their contributions to avoid being perceived as showing off or making others feel inadequate. This intellectual masking creates its own form of psychological stress because it requires constant self-monitoring and suppression of natural cognitive processes. Advanced thinkers learn to pause between having an insight and sharing it, asking themselves whether others will be able to follow their reasoning, whether the timing is appropriate, and whether the potential backlash is worth the attempt at communication. This constant self-censorship becomes so automatic that many forget what it feels like to think freely in social contexts, leading to a split between their private intellectual life and their public persona that can feel inauthentic and exhausting. The research also reveals how advanced cognitive development can create a particular kind of depression that mainstream psychology often misdiagnoses. When someone operating at formal operational levels feels persistently misunderstood, intellectually isolated, and frustrated by their inability to connect authentically with others, the resulting emotional state can look like clinical depression but has entirely different underlying causes. Traditional therapeutic approaches that focus on changing thought patterns or challenging negative beliefs often miss the mark because the problem isn't distorted thinking, but rather the natural consequences of cognitive development creating genuine barriers to human connection. Piaget observed that many advanced thinkers develop what he called cognitive melancholy, a persistent sadness that comes from recognizing that their natural way of processing reality isolates them from the very connections humans need for emotional well-being. This isn't a disorder to be treated, but rather an existential challenge that requires different kinds of solutions. The individuals who managed this challenge most successfully found ways to honor their cognitive complexity while developing compassion for those operating at different developmental stages, learning to appreciate different types of intelligence and connection rather than constantly seeking cognitive peers. One particularly fascinating aspect of Piaget's research involved studying how advanced thinkers navigate what he called cognitive camouflage, the various strategies they develop to hide their true cognitive capabilities in social situations. Some learned to ask questions they already knew the answers to, feigning confusion about concepts they understood perfectly, in order to help others feel more capable and to avoid the social penalties that come with appearing too insightful. Others developed elaborate systems for translating their complex thoughts into simpler language, essentially becoming cognitive interpreters for their own insights. The most successful learners found ways to guide others toward insights without explicitly stating them, allowing people to feel like they were discovering things themselves rather than being taught. These adaptation strategies, while necessary for social survival, come with their own costs. Advanced thinkers who constantly camouflage their cognitive capabilities often lose touch with their own intellectual authenticity, forgetting what it feels like to express their thoughts without filtration or translation. They may develop imposter syndrome, beginning to doubt their own insights because they've spent so much time pretending to be less perceptive than they actually are. The constant code switching between their natural cognitive processes and socially acceptable thinking patterns can create a kind of intellectual vertigo where they're no longer sure which thoughts are authentic and which are performances. Perhaps most tragically, this cognitive isolation often prevents advanced thinkers from finding each other. Because everyone is so busy camouflaging their capabilities and dumbing down their insights, people operating at similar cognitive levels may interact for years without recognizing their compatibility. They miss opportunities for the kind of intellectual intimacy they crave because both parties are so conditioned to hiding their true cognitive complexity that they never reveal enough of themselves to recognize a peer. Piaget noted that some of his most cognitively advanced research subjects reported their greatest regret was not recognizing other advanced thinkers sooner, having spent decades feeling alone while surrounded by potential intellectual companions who were equally skilled at cognitive camouflage. The implications for education and child development are profound, because Piaget's research suggests that pushing children toward advanced cognitive stages too quickly might actually be setting them up for future isolation. Children who achieve formal operational thinking significantly earlier than their peers often struggle socially throughout their development, finding themselves cognitively out of sync with age mates and unable to connect with adults who don't take their advanced capabilities seriously. These intellectually gifted children frequently report feeling like aliens among their peers, understanding concepts and seeing patterns that no one else their age can grasp, leading to early experiences of cognitive loneliness that shape their expectations for human relationships throughout life. The paradox deepens when we consider that the very cognitive capabilities that create isolation are also the ones that make the greatest contributions to human knowledge and progress. Piaget himself embodied this contradiction, revolutionizing our understanding of human consciousness while often feeling misunderstood and isolated by the very community he was trying to serve. His advanced cognitive development allowed him to see patterns in human thinking that others missed, but it also created barriers to collaboration and communication that made his professional life challenging. He understood the irony that his greatest insights came from a way of thinking that made it difficult to share those insights effectively with others. This creates what Piaget termed the genius paradox, where individuals with the cognitive capabilities to solve humanity's most complex problems are often the least equipped to navigate the social and emotional realities of human collaboration. They can understand abstract systems better than anyone, but struggle with the concrete interpersonal dynamics required to implement their insights. They can see solutions to problems others don't even recognize yet, but lack the social cognitive skills to build the coalitions necessary to put those solutions into practice. The very cognitive architecture that makes breakthrough thinking possible also creates personality patterns that make social leadership difficult. The research reveals that this isolation isn't inevitable, but overcoming it requires advanced thinkers to develop what Piaget called cognitive empathy, the ability to understand and work within others' cognitive limitations without judgment or frustration. This involves recognizing that people operating at different developmental stages aren't choosing to think simply or concretely, but are literally constrained by their current cognitive architecture. Just as you wouldn't get angry at a child for not understanding calculus, advanced thinkers need to develop patience with adults who haven't yet developed formal operational capabilities. Developing cognitive empathy requires advanced thinkers to study cognitive development itself, understanding the specific limitations and capabilities of each stage so they can communicate more effectively across developmental gaps. Instead of expecting others to rise to their cognitive level, they learn to translate their insights into the cognitive language that others can actually process. This doesn't mean dumbing things down, but rather finding ways to present complex ideas through the specific cognitive structures that different people have available. The most successful advanced thinkers, according to Piaget's research, are those who learn to find meaning and connection through teaching and mentoring rather than seeking cognitive peers. They discover that helping others develop their cognitive capabilities can be deeply satisfying, even if those others never reach the same level of development. They learn to appreciate the unique perspectives and insights that different cognitive stages provide, recognizing that cognitive diversity creates richer understanding than cognitive uniformity ever could. However, this path requires advanced thinkers to fundamentally reframe their expectations for human relationships and intellectual satisfaction. Instead of seeking others who can match their cognitive complexity, they need to find ways to appreciate the different types of intelligence and connection that people at various developmental stages can offer. This might mean valuing someone's emotional intelligence, even if their abstract reasoning is limited, or appreciating someone's practical problem-solving skills, even if they struggle with hypothetical thinking. The journey toward cognitive peace also requires advanced thinkers to develop what Piaget called intellectual humility, recognizing that their advanced cognitive development, while creating certain capabilities, also creates blind spots and limitations. Their ability to think abstractly might make them miss concrete details that others notice immediately. Their tendency to analyze systems might prevent them from appreciating simple pleasures that concrete thinkers enjoy naturally. Their complex problem-solving abilities might overcomplicate situations where simple solutions would be more effective. Understanding these trade-offs helps advanced thinkers develop more balanced perspectives on their cognitive isolation. Instead of viewing their loneliness as purely negative, they can begin to see it as one consequence of a cognitive style that also provides unique capabilities and perspectives. This doesn't eliminate the loneliness, but it provides context that makes it more bearable and less likely to lead to depression or social withdrawal. The research also reveals the importance of advanced thinkers finding at least some outlets for their full cognitive capabilities, even if they can't express them in most social contexts. This might involve engaging with complex literature, pursuing challenging hobbies, or finding online communities where cognitive complexity is valued and appreciated. Having spaces where they can think freely without translation or camouflage helps prevent the intellectual stagnation that can occur when advanced thinkers spend too much time operating below their natural cognitive level. Piaget's later work focused on what he called cognitive integration, the process by which advanced thinkers learn to honor their complexity while still connecting meaningfully with others at different developmental stages. This involves developing multiple cognitive voices within themselves, learning when to use different levels of abstraction and complexity depending on the context and audience. Rather than viewing this as inauthentic, they learn to see it as a form of cognitive multilingualism that allows them to connect across developmental barriers while still maintaining access to their full cognitive capabilities. The ultimate insight from Piaget's research is that the loneliness of advanced understanding isn't a personal failing or a problem to be solved, but rather a natural consequence of cognitive development that requires its own form of wisdom to navigate successfully. Advanced thinkers need to grieve the limitations this places on their relationships, while also celebrating the unique perspectives and capabilities it provides. They need to find ways to honor their complexity without using it as a barrier to human connection, learning to love others not despite their cognitive limitations, but including them. The path forward involves recognizing that walking alone isn't the only option for those who understand too much. But finding genuine connection requires developing new skills and perspectives that mainstream society doesn't teach. It requires learning to see cognitive diversity as a strength rather than a barrier, finding ways to appreciate the full spectrum of human intelligence rather than only valuing abstract reasoning capabilities. As Piaget discovered in his own life, the deepest satisfaction for advanced thinkers often comes not from finding cognitive peers, but from using their capabilities in service of others' development and well-being. When someone who understands complex systems uses that understanding to create better conditions for everyone, when someone who sees patterns others miss uses those insights to prevent problems before they occur, when someone who thinks abstractly finds concrete ways to improve people's daily lives, the isolation begins to transform into a form of service that creates its own type of meaning and connection. The loneliness never completely disappears, but it becomes bearable when it's held within a larger framework of purpose and contribution. Advanced thinkers learn that they don't need others to fully understand them in order to love and be loved, that cognitive compatibility isn't the only foundation for meaningful relationships, and that their unique way of seeing the world can be a gift to others, even when those others can't fully comprehend the complexity behind the insights they receive. This transformation requires patience, both with themselves and others, as they learn to navigate a world that wasn't designed for their particular type of mind, while still honoring the fullness of who they are and what they're capable of understanding. This brings us back to Piaget himself, in that Geneva laboratory, surrounded by colleagues who couldn't see what he was seeing, feeling the profound isolation that comes with breakthrough understanding. But here's what changed everything for him, and what can change everything for anyone walking this path of cognitive loneliness. Piaget didn't find his peace by discovering other researchers who matched his insights, though a few eventually emerged. He found it by reframing his entire relationship to understanding itself, recognizing that his advanced cognitive development wasn't meant to connect him with cognitive peers, but to serve as a bridge between different levels of human awareness. Instead of lamenting that others couldn't rise to his level, he learned to translate complex insights into forms that could nurture others' cognitive growth, becoming not just a researcher, but a cognitive midwife, helping others birth new ways of thinking. The transformation began when Piaget realized that his loneliness was actually pointing him toward his true purpose. Every frustrating conversation where others couldn't grasp his insights, every moment of feeling misunderstood, every instance of having to dumb down complex ideas wasn't evidence of his failure to connect, but rather information about where his unique gifts were most needed. The cognitive gaps that created his isolation were exactly the spaces where his particular form of intelligence could make the greatest difference. He stopped trying to find people who could match his understanding and started looking for people whose understanding he could expand, shifting from seeking cognitive companions to becoming a cognitive catalyst for others' development. This shift fundamentally changed how Piaget experienced his relationships and his work. Instead of feeling frustrated when colleagues needed step-by-step explanations for concepts that seemed obvious to him, he became fascinated by the specific cognitive structures that were preventing their understanding. He started seeing these interactions not as evidence of others' limitations, but as opportunities to map the exact boundaries between different developmental stages. Each conversation became research. Each explanation became an experiment in cognitive translation. Each moment of confusion from others became data about how understanding actually develops and transforms. The loneliness didn't disappear overnight, but it began to take on different meaning. Piaget described it as evolving from a source of pain into a form of responsibility. His advanced cognitive development wasn't a curse that isolated him from others, but a tool that could help others expand their own cognitive capabilities. The very characteristics that made social connection difficult, his ability to see patterns others missed, his tendency to think systemically, his natural inclination toward abstract reasoning, these became instruments for helping others develop beyond their current cognitive limitations rather than barriers to authentic relationship. This reframe requires understanding that cognitive loneliness often signals not just advanced development, but also an incomplete understanding of what that development is actually for. Most people assume that intelligence exists primarily for personal benefit, for solving their own problems and advancing their own interests. But Piaget's research suggests that the highest forms of cognitive development naturally orient toward service, toward using advanced understanding to create conditions that support others' growth and well-being. The isolation that comes with advanced thinking often persists until the individual discovers how to use their cognitive gifts in service of collective human development rather than personal satisfaction. The practical implications of this shift are profound. Instead of hiding cognitive capabilities to avoid making others uncomfortable, advanced thinkers can learn to use those capabilities to help others feel more capable themselves. Instead of dumbing down insights, they can learn to present them in ways that stretch others' thinking without overwhelming them. Instead of feeling frustrated by others' cognitive limitations, they can become curious about how to work within those limitations while gently expanding them. The same cognitive complexity that creates isolation can become the foundation for the kind of teaching and mentoring that creates deep, meaningful connection across developmental differences. Piaget discovered that this approach not only reduced his isolation, but also enhanced his own cognitive development in unexpected ways. When he focused on translating complex ideas into simpler forms, he often discovered new layers of understanding within his own insights. When he worked to understand others' cognitive limitations, he became more aware of his own blind spots and assumptions. When he learned to appreciate different forms of intelligence, his own thinking became more flexible and comprehensive. The process of serving others' cognitive development actually accelerated his own growth in ways that purely intellectual pursuits never could. This creates what Piaget called the service paradox of advanced cognitive development. The very capabilities that isolate advanced thinkers from cognitive peers can become the foundation for deeper, more meaningful connections with people at all developmental levels, when those capabilities are oriented towards service rather than seeking understanding. A formal operational thinker who learns to help concrete operational thinkers solve problems more effectively often finds more satisfaction in those relationships than they ever found in seeking cognitive equals. The connection happens not at the level of cognitive similarity, but at the level of mutual growth and contribution. The key insight is that advanced thinkers need to fundamentally redefine what they're seeking in relationships. Instead of looking for people who can understand them fully, they can look for people they can serve effectively. Instead of seeking cognitive validation, they can seek opportunities to use their understanding in ways that make others' lives better. Instead of trying to find intellectual equals, they can focus on becoming intellectual assets to everyone they encounter, regardless of others' developmental level. This shift from seeking to serving transforms the entire experience of cognitive complexity from a burden into a gift. This doesn't mean abandoning the need for intellectual stimulation or accepting shallow relationships. Rather, it means finding intellectual satisfaction through the complex challenge of translating insights across cognitive barriers, through the deep work of understanding how different minds process information, through the creative problem of helping others think more effectively within their current capabilities, while gently expanding those capabilities over time. The intellectual challenge shifts from seeking complex ideas to share with cognitive peers, to mastering the even more complex art of cognitive translation and developmental facilitation. Piaget's later years were marked by this kind of fulfillment as he watched generations of educators, parents, and researchers apply his insights to help children develop more effectively. He found that watching others use his understanding to enhance human development provided deeper satisfaction than any intellectual conversation with cognitive peers ever could have. The loneliness transformed into a form of purposeful solitude that created space for the kind of deep thinking and careful observation that his work required, while also connecting him meaningfully with countless people whose lives were improved by his insights. For anyone currently walking this path of cognitive isolation, Piaget's example offers a roadmap that doesn't require finding other advanced thinkers or dumbing down your natural capabilities. It requires recognizing that your advanced cognitive development is not primarily about you, but about what you can offer to the collective human project of growth and understanding. Your ability to see patterns others miss is meant to help others navigate complexity more effectively. Your tendency to think systemically is meant to help others understand how different pieces of their lives connect. Your capacity for abstract reasoning is meant to help others transcend the limitations of purely concrete thinking when situations call for more sophisticated approaches. This perspective transforms every frustrating social interaction into a potential opportunity for service. When someone can't grasp a concept that seems obvious to you, instead of feeling frustrated, you can become curious about what specific cognitive structures would help them understand better. When people seem stuck in limited thinking patterns, instead of feeling superior, you can explore how to present alternatives that work within their current cognitive frameworks while gently expanding them. When conversations feel intellectually unsatisfying, instead of withdrawing, you can shift your focus from what you're not getting to what you might be able to give. The research shows that advanced thinkers who make this shift report not only reduced loneliness, but also enhanced sense of purpose and meaning in their daily interactions. They discover that using their cognitive gifts in service of others' development provides the kind of intellectual stimulation they were seeking in cognitive peers, but with the added satisfaction of making a tangible difference in people's lives. They find that helping others think more effectively is actually more cognitively demanding and rewarding than having intellectual conversations with equals, because it requires understanding multiple cognitive frameworks simultaneously while creating bridges between them. This transformation also addresses the existential dimension of cognitive loneliness. Many advanced thinkers struggle not just with social isolation, but with questions about why they have capabilities that seem to separate them from others. When those capabilities are reframed as tools for service rather than barriers to connection, the existential weight shifts. Instead of wondering why they're different, they can focus on how their differences can contribute to human flourishing. Instead of feeling burdened by their advanced development, they can feel grateful for capabilities that allow them to serve in unique ways. The journey requires patience and practice, because learning to use advanced cognitive capabilities in service of others' development is itself a complex skill that takes time to master. Advanced thinkers need to study cognitive development, learn to recognize different thinking patterns, and develop techniques for working effectively within others' cognitive constraints while gently expanding them. They need to cultivate genuine curiosity about how different minds work, rather than judgment about cognitive limitations. They need to find satisfaction in others' growth rather than in being understood themselves. But for those willing to make this shift, Piaget's research suggests that the rewards extend far beyond reduced loneliness. Advanced thinkers who orient their capabilities towards service often discover that they become more cognitively flexible themselves, more emotionally intelligent, more creative in their problem-solving, and more effective in all their relationships. The process of learning to connect across cognitive barriers develops new capabilities that purely intellectual pursuits never could, creating a form of integrated intelligence that combines cognitive sophistication with emotional wisdom and practical effectiveness. If you've made it this far in this exploration, there's something I want you to know. The fact that you're here, seeking to understand the deeper patterns of cognitive development and human connection, suggests that you might be one of those people walking the path of advanced understanding. You might have recognized yourself in these descriptions of cognitive loneliness, felt the relief of finally having words for experiences you thought were uniquely yours, maybe even cried a little, recognizing that you're not alone in this particular form of isolation. If this journey we've taken together has touched something deep in your experience, I want to invite you to continue discovering not just how your mind works, but how your unique way of understanding can become a gift to the world around you. This isn't just about learning more psychology or collecting interesting insights. This is about finding your place in the human community, not despite your cognitive complexity, but because of it. Every week, I explore different aspects of how human consciousness develops, how different minds work, and most importantly, how people with advanced understanding can find meaning and connection in a world that often doesn't quite get them. If you're ready to transform your cognitive isolation into purposeful service, if you want to learn how to use your insights to help others grow rather than just seeking others who can understand you, then you belong here with us. Hit that subscribe button, not just to learn more, but to join a community of people who understand that advanced cognitive development isn't about being better than others, but about being better for others. Together, we're exploring how the very capabilities that can isolate us can become our greatest tools for connection and contribution. You're not alone in this journey anymore, and your unique perspective is exactly what our community needs to understand human development more completely. Next week, we're diving deep into another aspect of Piaget's work that most people never hear about. How children who develop cognitive abilities too quickly often struggle with emotional regulation throughout their lives, and what parents and educators need to know to support gifted children without accidentally setting them up for the same kind of isolation we've explored today. It's called When Smart Kids Can't Handle Their Own Intelligence. And if you've ever wondered why intellectual giftedness sometimes comes with such emotional challenges, you won't want to miss it.